Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I am very excited to have you all here for this very exciting discussion about a story that has been told many times in the past 100+ years, but never told quite like what we're going to do today. My name is Nora Kyle Messier. I am the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at the museum, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists. But before we do that, it is our custom here at the museum always to begin every program and every gathering that we have by acknowledging whose land this museum stands on and whose land this island is. It is Noepe, here, Nabnakit, where we are presently, the ancestral homeland of the Wampanoag people and their homeland still. We are always grateful for their ongoing stewardship of our island and their contributions to our community. And today especially, I think it extremely important to acknowledge that, given that the widow Rocker, as she has gone down in history being known, was in part a Chappaquiddick woman. Before we begin the conversation in earnest, I would like to introduce all of our esteemed panelists, beginning with Patricia Rocker, who is the great-great-granddaughter of the woman herself. She is the council chairwoman of the Chappaquiddick tribe of the Wampanoag Nation, Whale Clan, and an advisory council member of the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. Patricia. I would also like to introduce Skip Finley, broadcaster and author and researcher, and we're happy to have him with us too. Andrew Patch, researcher and president of the Martha's Vineyard Camp Meeting Association. Elaine Weintraub, educator, historian, and co-founder of the Martha's Vineyard African American History Trail, and our very own A. Bowden Van Riper, also known as Bo, who is an author, historian, and our research librarian here at the museum. So our conversation today is going to begin with the traditional version of the events surrounding Eunice Rocker's arrest for pauperism and removal from the island, the version that has colored our understanding of her life and circumstances for over 100 years. Then we're going to look at it together from several different angles. What was the island like in the 1880s, and how did a community like Cottage City, now Oak Bluffs, treat its citizens of color? How did that society shape the dominant narrative that was used and reused in the coming decades? Then we're going to hear about new research that changes the facts of the case, and a bit about historiography. The stuff we do here at the museum changes when new information becomes available to us. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to respond to the questions they are asked as we move through the discussion. We'll have dedicated time at the end for all of you to join in the conversation. But if you have specific questions to clarify a panelist's contribution, please just raise your hand. Hopefully all of you have had now a moment to review the reading materials that we provided. That is an article from the Cottage City Star, an island newspaper, in 1885, describing in great detail, in the language of the time, the events of the day that Eunice Rocker and her family were removed from a residence in Cottage City, now Oak Bluffs, for, as I said, pauperism. To begin, Bo, if you would be so kind, could you tell, especially for those who haven't read the article, could you give us a traditional version of this story as it has been told since 1885?
Sure. The bare bones of the story as it's traditionally been told is that Eunice Rocker, widow of Antone Rocker, was a public pauper living in the newly independent town of Cottage City, who, after being a drain on the town's resources for some years, was the subject of an order from the state overseers of the poor to be removed along with her children to the almshouse in Tewksbury. The constable of Cottage City went to the house where Eunice Rocker and her children were staying to deliver this order and enforce it, to send them off on the boat to Tewksbury, where they'd be housed and fed at the state's expense. And Eunice Rocker and the other women who were gathered at the house declined to leave. As the Cottage City Star story makes clear, declined forcefully for hot fat, hot water, irons, and other improvised melee weapons levels of forcefully. They're described in the story as a yelling, howling, praying, and screeching mob of demoniacal women.
Yeah.
The constable beat a hasty retreat, knowing when reinforcements were in order, and he summoned them in the form of the Cottage City selectmen and various other male authority figures who arrived with hammers and axes and attempted to beat down the door. How well this worked out for them can be inferred from the fact that later in the Cottage City Star story there was a reference to Joseph Diaz, one of the town officials, also one of the architects of Cottage City's recent independence from Edgartown, suffering an axe wound on the temple, and the constable suffering a severe scald on one arm, and so on and so forth. It can be reasonably inferred that the women in the house managed to remove the axes and hammers from the hands of those trying to beat down the door of what the Cottage City Star interestingly refers to but doesn't elaborate on as their little castle, and turn them against the would-be intruders. Eventually, in fairly short order, the violence subsided without any permanent injury to anybody involved, and eventually the workings of the state and local governmental machinery saw Eunice Rocker and her children packed off to Tewksbury in the almshouse. But as Art Railton, in his article from the February 2006 Dukes County Intelligencer, which brought the Eunice Rocker story to the attention of most of us in the Vineyard history community who hadn't heard about it through family tradition, points out the story doesn't end there. Rocker's case attracted the attention of people throughout southern Massachusetts, and she and her children were in fairly short order, to use a highly non-technical term, sprung from the almshouse. I admit legal means no melee weapons involved. And settled with friends in New Bedford, where they were housed and cared for and allowed to live like decent human beings. The same unnamed, or at least unnamed as far as I know, friends in New Bedford helped Eunice Rocker file suit against the Commonwealth for her treatment, and she eventually received a judgment in her favor, which allowed her to buy a home in Cottage City where she lived for the rest of her days. And unlike her husband, who was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's field when he died in 1866, shortly before the last of their 9 children was born, Eunice is today commemorated by a stone that says simply Eunice Rocker, Mother. But as Art Railton pointed out, it could also have read Eunice Rocker, homeowner, Eunice Rocker, never again a pauper. And that, until relatively recently, is the story as it's come down to us. The story of an indigent woman who, in the company of other women, resisted the efforts of the state to turn her out of the house where she'd been living and send her off into a foreign part of the state to live as a public charge, and who went further and actually achieved, through her own efforts and with the help of others, justice on her behalf, and was able to establish herself as a, if not prosperous, at least independent and self-governing citizen of Cottage City.
Thank you both. Skip, you have done lots and lots of research on Martha's Vineyard in the 19th century. Does the incident in question here, the removal of Eunice Rocker, does this fit with any larger trends or patterns that you have identified in your 19th century research into our island?
Generally, yes. What I brought was I wrote a piece. I used to be the Oak Bluffs town columnist for the Vineyard Gazette. So in 2013, this was a piece I wrote in the column.
You were alive then, Skip?
Yeah. Still. Born in 1847, Eunice C. Rocker had anything but an easy life. It has not yet been easy to be a woman, but to have been Black, a Wampanoag descendant, and a widow living in Oak Bluffs with 9 children at 36 years old in 1883 is the definition of challenging. That notwithstanding, due to being declared chronic paupers, she and her family were forcibly removed from the new cottage city by its constable with several selectmen and sent to the Tewksbury almshouse. The removal included an initial violent attempt to remove the family from their grandmother's home on Lake Avenue outside the campgrounds, with family and female friends winning the initial assault, but losing when reinforcements were called in. A hue and cry ensued, publicly covered by the late Cottage City Star, nastily accusing the Vineyard Gazette of weeping on the family's behalf. Among the issues, besides the town having had to pay for assistance, medical care and books totaling $155.48, by the way, that's worth about $400 and some in today's money, was the assertion that Edgartown should have been responsible for the family, if not the state. The Gazette position was that the notion that paupers can be carted about from place to place until the lawyers find a locality where they can be made to stick is certainly a novel one. The Gazette went on to opine that these interesting people are only alleged paupers after all. They may have received a trifle of assistance in the remote past, but they claim now to be self-supporting, and there's no law condemning a person to perpetual pauperism because of a contemporary lapse from the highest affluence. The Gazette was proven right in the lawsuit that followed when the jury asserted there had been improper and unreasonable force in removing the family and awarded Eunice Rocker $450 in damages. While the family continued to cause controversy, Mrs. Rocker had the foresight to invest in land on the corner of Dukes County and Warwick Avenues on September 19, 1888, where she built the home she died in on August 8, 1911, leaving an estate of $450. $25 in personal property, 1 lot of land valued at $75, and 2 buildings valued at $350. I was reminded of the story thanks to the late Arthur Railton, as another house in Warwick Avenue was just torn down by the town for non-payment of taxes. The home next to it is condemned, the one next to it is in disrepair, and indeed, the entire block could use some love and affection. I urge you to go drive up Warwick Avenue today. It looks like a brand new section of Oak Bluffs. In the Vineyard Gazette story, they did report, if you will bear with me for 1 second, Mrs. Matthews told him to go away, but Mr. Davis told her it was no use to talk. Quote, unquote, "We're going to have you N-word, plural, out of there." So that's pretty much how this was being handled in those days. I think part of the larger story is in these times when Oak Bluffs was seceding from Edgartown, there was a huge issue of money, okay? The money came north to Oak Bluffs because that's where the tourists came. The money left the south because that's where whaling ended. In that rough period of time, it made a lot more sense, instead of you having to have people on the dole, as it were, and have your town paid for it, you wanted another town or another state to pay for it. And this is what happened. It didn't just happen here, it also happened with the William A. Martin family, okay, over the years, the whaling William A. Martin family, and several other Chappaquiddick, whaling, Native American or indigenous peoples. This was pretty much, how things worked in those days. Now also, a lot of times we forget, at this time in the town of Oak Bluffs, only 150 people lived in the town of Oak Bluffs. Literally fewer than 150 people voted for Oak Bluffs to secede from Edgartown. So it was a very, very, very small community while this occurred. Finally, this story is live on the Vineyard Gazette's time machine. Just during Vineyard Gazette, you can click on it. Hillary Wall Cox, who's the librarian of the Vineyard Gazette, and myself have been reading the Vineyard Gazette, which began its publishing in 1846. We're identifying everything that relates to anything of racial characteristics, that the papers had, so we'll be able to, at some point, source it directly. We happen to work with Google. I think you can search the Vineyard Gazette now back to 1994, Don't hold me to that because I don't do that work, Hillary does. But fairly soon, over the next 2 years or so, everything that's happened of a racial nature on Martha's Vineyard, at least since 1846, we'll be able to access pretty much immediately. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, are you
For the shade.
comfortable to the shade? Yeah.
Oh, I don't know how to do it.
Here.
I'm fine, but thank you for the coming in and
Thank you,
out.
Heather.
That's fine, yeah. I appreciate you.
Oh, well,
I'm
we
always
have to
cold.
see you
so that's
better.
fine,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You were glowing. It was like a
That was anger.
Oh, yeah.
Of course. Thank you, Skip. We appreciate particularly the insight that we'll be able to get for free online anything we want regarding race relations and the history of race on the island from the Vineyard Gazette. On that subject, Elaine, a question for you. In your research producing the narrative for the Martha's Vineyard African American History Trail, do you find or have you found other instances where there was perhaps disparate treatment of people, especially in cases like this, pauperism, etc.? Do you feel that Eunice Rocker's family's race was a factor in the insistence on removing her to the almshouse? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I'll start at the end of the question. Yes, of course, her race was a factor. It was the factor. And yes, I found many examples. I began my work on this more than 20 years ago, and I began, oddly enough, on Chappaquiddick, because William Martin, who had found the only African-American whaling captain from Martha's Vineyard, there were no records, but because he had been a whaling captain, there were official records. So it was a place to begin. And then with good history research, there's always more questions than answers. There was a lot of questions in my mind. Well, how did William Martin's house not be owned by William Martin's family? That was one of my questions. How did that happen? What was the line of succession there? So I did quite a lot of work in the Registry of Deeds and observed that with the division of land on the Anglo model on Chappaquiddick and Aquina and Christiantown, land was allocated to native people in lots. But there would be several owners because the concept of the man in charge owning everything wasn't there. So there'd be 7 or 8 family names and all of a sudden, one Anglo name. So I would look, well, how did 7 people from one family, and suddenly this person is in there? So I would look and see that it paid $50 to that person, and that's all registered. And within a few years, there were no native people owning them. So that certainly piqued my curiosity. Then Nancy Michael, who extensively researched, she was a public pauper, even though she had been held in enslavement, held and used for many years when enslavement was in fact illegal. And Edgartown had sued Tisbury over that because she'd been enslaved in Tisbury. So there was a very clear pattern. Mrs. Rocker was removed from her property in the campground, but between 1910 and 20, and I'll let Andrew address that more, 30 families were removed from the campground. People of color, either indigenous, African American. Part of the racialization of America in that period anyway, you know, where you have the establishment of white supremacy, the collapse of Reconstruction. But I found numerous cases where Priscilla Freeman, who was a Native American, was deprived of her fishing rights on the Great Pond, even though she owned land there. It was very consistent. There's no surprises at all. And the way it's described, and I think that's a powerful piece. I notice here, this piece is very disparaging, women who are pockmarked, women who what man could possibly fight these colored working women. It's very clear. and that language, even the Vineyard Museum piece on Eunice Rocker commends her for having some success in a very much Anglo-dominated white system. So, in answer to your question, yes, I have found many cases.
Not an isolated incident. Thank you very much.
Not one bit.
Fantastic. Patricia, you have the family story, and it has been passed down from generation to generation. Does the way the rest of the world has understood the story bear any resemblance to the story as it has been kept in your family?
No. None. And so what we as, citizens of this country need to recognize is there are many forms of injustice. Here in this country, if you're indigenous, it's about the stealing of land. And if you were of African descent, it's about the theft of labor. Eunice being sent to the pauper's house, and we have to understand what the pauper's house was. The pauper's house was a work camp. Your children were taken, the boys were put in one dormitory, the girls put in another dormitory, and the mother. All worked. Just like if you look at, it was so close to, Tewksbury is very close to Lawrence and Lowell. I don't know how many of you, what your immigration pattern was here, but if you were coming from Europe and you were not wealthy, typically you were being sent on boats, marched to go work, and locked in workhouses. So if we look at Southeast Asia and the Asian countries and parts of South America, and we look at those models of people being housed next to the factories where they worked, the same thing happened here in the United States. So we have to understand when Eunice was taken, they saw a widow woman with 9 children. The threats were, number one, those 9 children would become adults and live here on the island and reproduce. And there are close to 1,000 rockers out there, Margaret, all around the state. And yes, when they talked about the rocker women are tall. Rocker women are independent. Rocker women are assertive. These are women that worked with our men, and also our indigenous heritage of we were the landholders. We held the land. We took care of the gardens. We oversaw our land. We married. Men came to live with us on our property. If we decided they didn't quite cut it, we sent them away and we maintained our land. So this is a matriarchal society. With the women and becoming whalers, and just to clarify, we whaled pre and post contact. Our men and our families, women also, would go out in dugout canoes and go to Muskegon and hunt the seals. Our men and our women used to go out and hunt the whales. Now, you think of those huge masted ships going out and whaling and throwing a harpoon and those big rowboats. Think of that happening with a crew of people in a canoe. So going back to what I was saying, yes, our women are very, very strong. But one of the things I wanted to mention is our family was from the whaling society and were whalers. And there was money to be had. What we also need to recognize is most of the whalers, the merchantmen in the Navy, prior to, after Reconstruction and Jim Crow, they were heavily populated by people of color, and they were self-emancipated. And what emancipated means is they took their own lives, and under the current time, they would be referred to as runaway slaves. So they were self-emancipated. They got on ships, and they were able to go where they were. There's a story of Esther going out on the ship. That was a common occurrence. So just a little bit of a point of reference. I wanted to get back to about the land. This all started, this whole entire thing with the constable coming and them claiming that Eunice was a pauper. During the summertime, the family used to go over to the Chappaquiddick Island. First they lived in Edgartown, and I believe that they were redlined out of Edgartown, but I have to go on more research for that. And then they moved to Cottage City. And they were not renting the home. Margaret owned the home, and Andrew will give you a little bit more information on that. Margaret owned the home. She wasn't renting the home. So the home that they went to go arrest Eunice was her family home. And the women were laundresses. Laundresses back in that day there was a huge cast iron pot. You'd have to cut the wood. So the hatchets that they talk about in that fight, the hatchets, you cut the wood, put the wood underneath those huge cast iron pots. Water would go into those pots, you'd put the laundry. They serviced some of the private homes on the island. All of those vacationers needed to have their laundry done. Some of the guest houses, some of the hotels that were coming up, and they had a drop-off service. So you would have to come, drop off your laundry, and pick it up by a certain time. The women would go into those pods. These were tall women. All of our women are tall. Like Margaret's tall. I'm tall. I'm 6 feet. So what they would do is take a paddle to agitate. So when the constables came, yes, they could fight them off because they had a lot more upper body strength than probably a lot of those constables were, because as you know, you've got to position yourself with your feet and churn the pot. But going back to Chappaquiddick, going over to Chappaquiddick and talking about the theft of land, they would go over for 2 or 3 weeks over on the island and sort of like camp out and spend their time on their land. The summer prior to Eunice's arrest, they had gone over to the ferry. Back then, it was a Roman on the ferry, and he would row you across the island. Prior to that, the channel used to be somewhat closed, and they used to wait for the tides and be able to actually walk across in the tides. So it came about that they would have to use the ferry. When they got to the ferryman said some exorbitant price for them to get back onto the island. When the women started, giving them a little bit of a hard time knowing what the ferry was supposed to be, the ferryman rowed out into the middle of the channel, so they could not access the boat. We also think that there was the pre-planned type of event, because there were men that came down. I don't know if it was the police, I don't know if it's constable, I just know that there were men from the city that came down. There was a confrontation, a verbal argument. At some point, Margaret, our great-great-great-great-grandmother, got knocked down. And that ended up in a physical confrontation. And from my understanding, Eunice was probably close to my size, strong woman. So there's shoving ensued, and what ended up happening, the women carried that day also, because you had a lot of white privileged men that just thought that they were going to push around these women, and that didn't occur. So what ended up happening, the women packed up their things, irate, and walked all the way back home to Cottage City with their luggage and their children. So they got back there. Then we flashpoint to November when they came with the constables, the warrant to have them removed. And as I said, it was Margaret's home. The family lived there in that home. There were several different women living in the home, as well as some of their neighbors, and they worked with the laundress group. So it was a large group of them. And when you read that document, it was sort of like proof positive that they were laundresses. They had hot water you always had hot water if you're a laundress, because you always have to have it to wash the clothes. Right. There was oil that was thrown. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but if you have an oil stain, and a lot of the products that we have, the protein, so oil would be used on oil to remove an oil, and then you'd scrub it out with it. So if there's anyone here that does laundry and hates to see stains, you would know that. They had hatchets themselves, because the hatchets were used to cut the wood. They threw their irons, and I don't know if anyone's seen the old-fashioned irons. A lot of people use them now to hold the doors, because they are literally made from a heavy metal, and those were being thrown. So yes, it's sort of further proof of the fact that these women were laundresses, because they had all of these tools at their hand, and it was the tools that they used in their occupation. So the women were laundresses. They came with a warrant for 9 children. 8 children went with them. Luckily, one of them was old enough and told to run off. It was a case of they just couldn't fight anymore, because they were frightened that more would come. And a lot of the women that fought with them, that they didn't have warrants for, was taken to the local goal, I'll call it, and held for a period of time. And I don't know what happened with those cases. I contacted Elaine back in November when they ran the story about Widow Rocker in the Martha's Vineyard Museum, because I saw it, and then I started responding to it. And then it sort of like got going, and I said to Elaine, would we be able to do something in regard to the plaque when we're here on the island, because the majority of us don't live on the island. We live in other places. I wanted to just make sure as many of us could be here to see the plaque dedicated to Eunice. And then this was an afterthought where I contacted Moira and had a conversation with Andrew and Skip to try and see if they would be willing to just sit in this group. Did I answer your question enough?
I think so.
Okay. Any questions?
All right, so now we have heard in greater detail from the family version of the story and the big reveal. Andrew, you have been doing all manner of research into Cottage City in roughly this time period, and I understand you have yet more new information to share with us on the case of Widow Rockers.
Well, a couple of pieces of information. Let me first say I was put onto the story, as is the case with many stories, by my good friend Skip and his prolific writings, because I read the write-up that he had done of this incident, reached out to him for more information. He pointed me to the article by Arthur Railton in the February 2006 Dukes County Intelligencer. I was able to access that readily online because one of those public services during the pandemic was to digitize all of the back issues of the Dukes County Intelligencer and make them available free online, which is a tremendous resource, tremendous public service.
And searchable.
And searchable, yeah. So, but that at the time I was doing some independent research with respect to how the Camp Meeting Association treated its early residents of color, and part of that research was just to identify where they were in the campground. And this trail site number 35 that was dedicated just the other day on June 24th identifies or rediscovers this community of about 30 cottages that existed on our westernmost fringe along Dukes County Avenue and what's now our Wamsutta parking lot, but which used to be Wamsutta Avenue. But the other area where there were a smaller number of cottages owned by people of color was on the northernmost part of Central Avenue in the campground. Now, in the Railton article, he refers to Eunice Rocker's mother, Margaret Prince Matthews, as having rented a cottage on the fringe of the campground on Lake Avenue. But in digitizing our own lease records, which are now much more readily searchable, what I found was that Margaret Prince Matthews was a cottage owner, not a renter, and that her cottage was not on the fringe of the campground, it's in the campground, albeit at the northernmost part, and that cottage is still there. And it's
Near Joe Diaz's house.
well, near that, it's on 14 Central Avenue, and part of, I think, what may have thrown Arthur Railton off the scent was that in the early days, in the 1800s, that northernmost section of Central Avenue was called Lake Park, and it had a different name then. But what's now 14 Central Avenue is the house in question, and it wasn't rented, it was owned by Margaret Prince Matthews. It was owned by her starting about 1876 until her death in 1895. So that was a significant discovery. Furthermore, in that same section, and when I refer to the northernmost part of Central Avenue, that might not be vivid in terms of where exactly I'm talking about. If you're at Nancy's and you look across Lake Avenue, that entrance to the campground, that's Central Avenue. And what you can see, even from Nancy's, is that northernmost section. So 14 Central is just the second house in on the left. The third house in on the left is 12 Central Avenue. That was the house that was owned by the Reverend William Jackson from 1871 until his death in 1900, thereafter by his daughter Mary until her death in 1922, I believe it was. So these were some of the first cottages in all of Oak Bluffs, and certainly in the Camp Meeting Association, owned by people of color in the 19th century. Just the fact that the cottage still exists and is on the grounds of the Camp Meeting Association was a new discovery, and I think facilitated what we're happy to participate in this afternoon in terms of a lasting commemoration of what happened. In terms of the people involved, they're identified as the Cottage City Overseers of the Poor, and so it was not officially a campground action in the sense that we're not officially the villains in this story, and yet you have Otis Foss, who was a longtime campground resident who operated a dry goods store in Commonwealth Square. You have Joe Diaz, who Skip again has researched extensively, who was the proprietor of the Vineyard Grove House at the southern end of Siloam Avenue, and that a remnant of that building still exists today, and we call it the Tabernacle House. So these were campground folk, even if they weren't acting in a campground capacity, who were carrying out this forcible removal.
Thank you, Andrew. A sort of final question to you, Bo, before we open it up for general conversation and questions. How do incidents like this change in the telling when new research becomes available?
Great question.
Good question.
As you know, is the characteristic call of a historian desperately trying to buy time to think of something intelligent to say.
I love putting you on the
spot. Inevitably, new information changes not only the scope of the story, but it also changes the way that the existing bits of the story relate to each other, the relative weight we give them, the way we think of them as interacting. And for me, the new information that's recently come to light illustrates this in two ways. One, the idea that Margaret Prince Matthews wasn't a renter but a homeowner changes profoundly our understanding of what went on the morning of February 3rd, 1882. I mean, in English and thus by extension American law, the doctrine that a man in the generic universal human sense that it was used in those days, a man has the right to be safe and free from molestation even by the duly constituted authorities in his own home, is so fundamental and so deeply rooted that the fact that Margaret Prince Matthews's home could be so casually violated, and that her and her family's ability to feel safe and whatnot in that home is underscored all the more strongly. I mean, the idea of the authorities trying to beat down your door with hammers and axes and take your children and your grandchildren away to the workhouse is appalling enough. But given the cultural meaning that for centuries has been loaded onto the concept of home ownership, it underscores the social and emotional violence of that event even more strongly, and in doing so underscores the absolute and, as Patricia accurately said, pervasive, and as Elaine also said, centrality of race to this story. Is it conceivable that if Margaret Prince Matthews was a white man of the same economic circumstances, the constable and the select board would have been breaking down his door in order to take his children? No, of course not. Would, what is it, pockmarked term again, have been used in the Cottage City paper of record if this had been a white man? No, of course not. Would the people helping him defend his home against this intrusion have been described as a yelling, howling, praying, and screeching mob of demoniacal men? No, of course not. Nor likely would an equivalent group of white women engaged in the same activity have been described in those terms. In the case of Widow Rocker, it is absolutely essential to always come back to the fact that this was a story about race, and to not let that slip to one side. And this seemingly small detail, rental versus ownership, is an opportunity to drag that central fact back where it belongs into the telling of the story. But also, the fact that Margaret Prince Matthews was a homeowner and that Eunice Rocker was, at the time of the February 1882 incident, no longer on public assistance in Cottage City or anywhere else, and had not been on public assistance for some time. The fact that she and her friends were working as laundresses, were participants in an ongoing and apparently profitable business. And Patricia's, to me, incredibly interesting and telling details. I did not, in fact, know diddly squat about 19th century laundry, nor the way it was organized, or the fact that it was a drop-off as opposed to any of that.
With them, because it was simply to cut off interaction, and they maintained that up until the time that my great-grandmother, Ethel Harmon, and it was beyond that when Margaret's grandmother, her great-grandmother, because we have different, but our great-grandfather is the same. They maintained that laundry for over 100 years. And I believe if we looked at Andrew's research, they applied for that cleaning, what was it called, the lease, on their lease?
A license, yeah.
And when was that, what year, do you remember what year that was?
It was the 1870s, I don't know the exact
So
year.
it was,
but
they had that laundry. So the concept that they were paupers, I question that, because even when the court case came, and we've requested the court case, we'll eventually get it, so we haven't looked at it because a lot of this has been moving very quickly. So I question whether or not that they were ever paupers. That's my question, because the court ruled against the Cottage City and the Commonwealth for that. So I just wanted to clarify one point, because I don't ever know that they were not working as laundresses. I believe that they were even laundresses in Edgartown, because it was a way for them to maintain their independence and not be working, because if you worked in someone's home, which was the lot of many indigenous and people of color and of African descent, that you were working in people's homes. And if you worked in someone's home, you had half a morning to yourself every single week. Half a morning. In some cases, you might have the whole morning off if you took you took your time off twice a week. So just so you understand. And one of the reasons when you read the different articles about them, that their children were hoodlums walking around. My uncle went foraging. Like, I still go blueberry picking and go clamming and scalloping and all those types of things. They would go foraging. They weren't hoodlums. It was just a case that they were used to seeing children of color contained in their, whatever home that they were working in, contained in a back space of the home, and they weren't free to go about. So that was part of if you read some of the language about the hoodlums, and it's sort of funny because you see it sometimes now in certain newspapers where we're going back to the past, that they're referring to people, young men of color, that they were hoodlums and termagants and stuff like that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
clarify.
No, this was great. And the thing about the laundry angle and the depth that Patricia's added to that, and the centrality of the laundry as a Rocker family business, is, I think, critically important, because it pulls out of the shadows not just an element of this story that's important, but it sheds light on one of the great untold stories in Vineyard history, which is that from the moment in the 1830s, certainly in the 1860s, the Vineyard developed a tourist economy. Initially at Wesleyan Grove during the camp meetings, then more broadly when the founders of the Oak Bluffs Real Estate Development established a secular resort in what became Cottage City. From the moment there was a tourist economy, there was a service economy underlying it. A service economy consisting of people in significant numbers of them, almost certainly women, significant numbers of them people of color, people like Eunice Rocker and her fellow laundresses, and hundreds over the course of the run of the tourist economy, thousands of others, all of whom are virtually lost to history, except in family tradition and in tiny bits and scraps of references that can be gleaned from contemporary newspapers. Thank you, Skip. Thank you, Gazette. Thank you, Hillary, for making all that Gazette material available through the time machine. The Martha's Vineyard Museum and its predecessor, in its earlier incarnations, the Martha's Vineyard and Dukes County Historical Society, do not, to put it mildly, have over the entire century of their existence a real strong track record of paying attention to race, gender, and class in Martha's Vineyard history. In more recent years, it's gotten better noticeably about acknowledging that the vineyard has a Wampanoag history that extends past 1602, in acknowledging that the vineyard has an African American history. We even learned at some point in the past that women did other things other than be married to whaling captains and look winsomely from the edges of their widow's walks. Because, you know, when you've got to cook, clean, keep the accounts, look after the children, negotiate with the dry goods store owner to extend your credit until husband comes back with, hopefully, some kind of income from the 4 years he's been away. You know, clearly you've got hours on end to stand on top of your damn roof and hope that this will be the day that husband's ship swings around Starbucks head. I'm sorry, this has been a completely off-topic rant. But of all the bogus romantic legends about this island's history, that is the one that rots my socks. To get back to the point, we as an organization, we, the historians of the vineyard, have gotten better about seeing race and gender in vineyard history. Not nearly as good as we need to be, but better. Class is still the great black hole of vineyard historiography, even in places where it should be so screamingly obvious that not even your garden variety amateur historian could possibly miss it. Say, in the resort culture that emerged in the aftermath of the 1860s. The dishes in those big 4-story Victorian hotels did not bust themselves, folks. The sheets did not magically iron themselves. The bags were not hauled from the steamer wharf to the front porch of the Pawnee House by elves. Actually, they were hauled by Fred James, a Wampanoag man who had a horse team and a low-slung wagon. Actually even turned up on postcards. The service economy that we now take for granted as a feature of vineyard life, and that now as then is overwhelmingly populated by people of color, who are now as then overwhelmingly invisible to the people whose lives of leisure they make possible, existed 200 years ago on the vineyard, doing similar things. And part of what the new information in this story does is to remind us yet again that they too are part of the history of the vineyard, and their stories too need to be, however difficult it is, tracked down and pieced together and told in particular terms if possible, or at least in general terms. So That was a longer answer than I intended to a question that I had no idea I was going to answer when you asked it. But back to you, Nora.
You got right at the heart of the matter. One of the most important things to me as a historian is that when new information comes to light, you include it in the developing narrative. And that is what we at the Martha's Vineyard Museum are striving to do by looking at untold stories and looking a second or third or 10th time at the stories that all of us think we know, to make sure that what we are presenting is factually accurate, but also consistent with our understanding of the events based on all of the available information and not just a narrow slice of the available information. With that, I would like to turn the conversation to our audience participants. If any of you have questions for our panelists, please ask. Yes.
My name is Margaret. I want to say thank you to you all. When I grew up knowing this story. My mom was Mildred Gonzalez. Her father was Harry Rocco, which was one of the 9 kids that happened that day. So we grew up knowing this story and didn't really like the story. Mm-hmm. So when I heard and read that this was going to be told, I contacted Elaine, Patricia, and Andrew and said, I don't want that story told. It's embarrassing. It hurts my heart. And after talking many conversations, Elaine convinced me that it is a story that needs to be told. And I wanted to just say thank you all for telling the story. Thank you.
So I'm curious, in your research, has anybody discovered that the percentage of people in all these poor farms, because I grew up right near the one in New Bedford, how is it clearly now, as we look back, that was a way to steal back the land from people of color, and or the percentage of people put into these poor farms? Is it a lot of natives? And
so, and this is where we all have to understand our immigrant past, and you're not settlers, you're immigrants. Some of you are colonizers, but you're immigrants. And so what we have to understand is there were certain populations of people that no one wanted coming to these shores. And that included the Irish, the Scottish, Southern Mediterraneans. So unless you were Northern European, United Kingdom, you were not wanted here. A huge population of people of Irish descent were sent to these. Many Portuguese families were sent to the almshouses. Yes, large populations of Native Americans and African Americans, but the largest population at the Tewksbury Almshouse itself was Irish immigrants, and the majority of them were being taken from Boston. And so, and Italians, but because there was, at that period of time, what I was looking at, it was mostly Irish people. And if anyone goes back and look at the history of the Irish in Massachusetts, and specifically Boston, you will see, there used to be signs, they switched to Italian at one point, but no Irish need apply, all of that information. And a lot of the things that you hear now spoken about, people of color or Africans or Syrians or Mexicans or whatever, some of that same language was used against Irish at that time. But the Tewksbury Almshouse, before it was closed, it saw a lot of Irish immigrants going in there. And just so you understand, for Eunice to go in, infant mortality back in that period of time was horrendous. If you had 4 children, probably 2 would survive past the age of 12. If you went to a facility like the Tewksbury Almshouse, where you have all children in together without any type of inoculation, that population of children, 20 would come out alive. So it was a death sentence to try and take 9 children and send them to the almshouse. And of course, the women back then, you had all types of disease. There was no inoculation. So the intent was, and to me, reading that's what hurt me the most, is her sending that, but going to the almshouse and seeing the records and the documentation. And the Tewksbury Almshouse is infamous. With the cruelty and some of the things that were done to the people there. There was I can't remember which university, it was either Pitt or Penn, that had done a study about the Tewksbury Almshouse that tells you a story. But the largest population at the almshouse was the Irish. And maybe in New Bedford, you might see the switch to a larger Portuguese population, just because I know that in Cape Verdean, I know that there was a larger population going in there, but it seemed to be the intake of the Irish from Boston. Lawrence and Lowell had a lot of those factories. So if somebody wasn't acting the way they wanted them to act, I think it was a case of sending them there. It's sort of like, if you think back, there used to be a thing of white women being sent by their husbands when they were tired of them, to send them to an asylum. So that's just the, I don't know what the population of the numbers that were sent, but at that facility, the large population was the Irish.
And the French Canadians in central Massachusetts.
Yes, the French Canadians, New Hampshire, and there was a program in Maine that went on up until the 1970s, where they were taking a lot of the French Canadians, Indigenous, and African people. So there, throughout this area, you'll see a lot of racism, and that becomes part of the programs of institutions, and it's there codified in their laws. So if you go back and look at those laws, a lot of that information is
Sort
there.
of like the northern version of the penal system.
Right. Right. It's taking, what ended up happening is, in this country after slavery, large populations of people came in to replace free slave labor, and that's when they changed a lot of the immigration laws. And what they did is started pulling people from the Mediterranean areas. The Irish and the Scottish were allowed to come in, but they were brought into factories and forced to doing cheap labor. And as soon as they started to act out, they would be sent to these places. Some would be forced to go, but others were sent to those facilities where they still worked, but they were working in horrific conditions.
Yeah.
I'm a big history buff, so sorry if I get too much information.
We always think of the workhouses as being very Dickensian and being in the United Kingdom, but no, there were workhouses here in this country as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add a note of context. 175 years and about 2 weeks ago, a man who named Amos Jeffers Jr. would have become the 6th self-identified Native American to become a whaling captain. You know, he wound up dying the day before because he decided to go sword fishing instead, and the swordfish beat him out the whale. But consider that year in 1847, you know, when all of this was just also casual. I can't find it here, but in the literature there is a line that says, as I paraphrase, of course this man didn't want to live next door to black people. All right, because that was the assumption that was made back then. You know, when Oak Bluffs, you know, was founded as a resort area, that was for a middle-class resort area, not the wealthy. The wealthy are not worried about black people, you know, or Native Americans. You know, it's the people who are middle class and below who even now today I worry about when I walk the streets. You know, because they're the ones, you know, who are going to feel threatened. They're the ones who are the have-nots more so, you know, than the haves. So in that context of what was going on in those times, there was the Earl study from 1831 when he came here, you know, hired by the state of Massachusetts, and was unable to find a single Native American on the island of Martha's Vineyard. Well, that was because, you know, the white man, you know, encouraged, you know, intermarriage so that the Native Americans would now become part black and not have access to the tribal lands. All right, so it was a way of, you know, dramatically reducing the social impact of two groups. Now that man, Amos Jeffers, for example, the reason I brought him up is because in the last 2 years, Jeffers Lane and the Jeffers Cemetery in Chappaquiddick have been named after the Jeffers family who owned the island in the first place. So that's what we're now dealing with, and it's only because it's not new information, it was the absence of this historical information. We haven't had it, now we have access to it, but now we have to find ways to interpret it. Okay, you know, and finding ways to interpret it, you know, it's very difficult, you know, particularly in Martha's Vineyard, to decide, are you black, or are you Native American, or are you both? So the way I've approached it is, you know, how do people self-identify? Okay, and that's going to be, you know, that's going to get to be a thing as we go forward, you know, from here, because there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't want to be known as or don't want to be called. Probably the best example is the Cape Verde community. You know, we know if you're from Cape Verde or Cabo de Verde, you know, now the country, we know you're from Africa, i.e. you're black. Well, they don't really think so. They have different religion, they have different food, they have different, you know, social practices, you know.
So doesn't everybody else.
There are a lot of different.
It's a huge
Right. But in the eyes of the person that encountered the white man, okay, you are all painted with the same brush. It's going to be up to us, you know, we writers, you future historians to redefine these stories and tell them as they happen, to tell the truth. Because right now we don't have all of it.
Yes.
I am addressing this to you, Skip, but that's only because something you said made me think of it, so anybody. From what you said, or from what I heard, there was, I'm trying to understand what was scaring those 150 people in Oak Bluffs so much that they did this, all right? And what I heard you say is that there had been some pauperism in Eunice Rocker's past, meaning a time when she was falling on hard times. But history to me is often follow the money. And so I'm trying to understand where the threat in terms of the money was. You talked about the poor people being supported by specific towns, and one town would want the other town to take care. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, you answered that, I'm gonna answer.
All right. Well, a couple things. Very specifically, right here in River City, in the town of Oak Bluffs. If it were not for the Native American and the black community, okay, and Colonel Flanders up in Chilmar, Oak Bluffs could not have seceded from the town of Edgartown. So you want to break down the financial terms, there it is, right there, almost literally that day, that's what happened. Okay, everybody got to vote. Only 100 or so people lived in the town of what became the town of Oak Bluffs. Edgartown had all the money, the power, the votes, the people, and everything else. But when it came time to vote, it was Captain Flanders from Chilmark who said, I'm siding with the black and Native American community of Farm Neck, and we're voting to allow Oak Bluffs to secede because they thought that was going to bring them a better life.
Bring them what?
A better life.
Oh.
And more opportunity.
And so to answer your question, why? Eunice, there is no documentation that proves anywhere that Eunice was a pauper at any time. There was nothing that was presented in the court case, and that's why she won the court case. Going back to why, my parents bought their home in West Peabody, Massachusetts. My mother grew up in South Peabody, Massachusetts at an old country farm. Their family had bought it hundreds of years before that from the gentleman that owned the quarry. They came down from Nova Scotia and bought this huge home, a Victorian home on an older street. When my mother went to go live in West Peabody, my mother didn't want to live in West Peabody because she knew that West Peabody had septic systems, didn't have sewers, and it used to be a pig farm. So when they built this new development in the 60s, my mother decided to go and move there. My father worked for General Electric. He was a mechanical engineer, unusual at that time, but we were doing well, upper middle class. Went to go buy the home. When we got there, my parents, they would not show my parents certain homes.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want these, my father coded more as black as opposed to my mother is a little bit lighter tone, and some people may think that she's white or something else. So they had decided that they didn't want to sell. So when we eventually bought the house, there was a lot of questions about where we were and that type of thing. So nothing has changed in this country. There are still states in this country that have sections of properties and lands and councils where there's still codified language, and it's allowed at the state level that you will not sell homes to people of Mexican descent, people of African descent, even people of Asian descent. There are things out there that says that. And I believe what ended up happening is once they got the language passed with that vote to allow Cottage City to happen, then it was decided that they were going to bring a community. You had a lot of people coming from the South, a lot of people that had racism, a lot of people that would love to come and live here, but then realize that you've got a large black population that had lived here. And just to, and Skip might speak to this, there was a large population of African Americans or blackjacks, the merchantmen, over in Edgartown during the whaling period. So I think there was also an attempt to remove some of the people from that area into the other areas because they went from Edgartown to Nantucket and then eventually ended up in New Bedford as the whaling center. So there was a large population here also.
And further, you know how rarely homes change hands, you know, now in the Martha's Vineyard. In fact, you can go to the registry in Edgartown right now today, and you can still find that language in codicils, you know, that do not allow homes, particularly in East Chop, to be sold to black people. Black and white, you can go and see it. Not hard to find, you know, at all. Of course, as it comes up, it's all changed because of, you know, new laws.
Well, I mean, those racially restrictive covenants, they're still, you can't give better title than you get, so they still run with the land. They're not enforceable since 1948. That was the Supreme Court case, Shelley v. Kramer, right? But they're still, even if they're not restated in your current deeds, if they were in there in the past, they run with the land, and they're still on, they still apply to many properties on the island and throughout the country. There's some jurisdictions, I don't know whether Massachusetts is among them, that have enacted statutes recently to make it a kind of a summary or abbreviated procedure to have those formally excised from the chain of title. But it's interesting to note that even if they're not restated, unless they've been excised, they're still there.
And Andrew hadn't said so, but he's also a patent attorney.
I think if I heard your question correctly, you were asking what were they afraid of?
In terms of money, they identified it as a money problem, and I'm trying to figure out if these women are running a business.
Who objects?
Well, no, yeah, not just who objects, but I just
They didn't
have a
want them.
prejudice in favor of money being a factor.
They didn't
Race
want
a factor, money a factor.
They just didn't want them there because of
But
race.
the women would be a threat to the system, because instead of really being paupers, that word gets thrown around and used as a definition, but these women were actually running a viable business. And this laundry business thing, we've many cases of that on the Heritage Trail, where we've found very successful businesses run by African American families, primarily women, and they constantly, there's a case where somebody was moved out of the campground and placed with others at Hiawatha Park, where she'll be happier. And I somehow doubt that her happiness was the whole issue. But segregation was a real, genuine thing. And to whatever the history that feeds that is, you know that these people have been dispossessed, right? I mean, Eunice Rocker's family had been moved from Chappaquiddick, right? Before they ended up in Cottage City. So
And Edgartown.
yes, so this was a definite pattern to segregate people. I mean, who were the laundry's customers? I would like to know that. But also, just in that age too, independent, strong women who were running their own business
On property that they owned.
On the
with property of their own,
Yeah.
and still managing to hang on to that property despite very strong official policies to get that off of you. They were a threat to the whole social order.
Well, in that context, then the pauperism was the same as being a witch, right?
Yes,
It
right.
was in 2 centuries before. If you were a strong, independent woman, you were a witch, and you needed to be getting.
In that sense, yes, because if you look at the story of Nancy Michael, who was born into enslavement in Chilmot, sold at the age of 6, and held and used, to use the terms of the court case, held and used as a slave for many years against the laws of Massachusetts, because slavery had been abolished, but nobody bothered to share it with her. Her obituary refers to her as a witch, that she acquired great influence over the people of our town. She sold good fortunes, by many of whom she was regarded as a witch. And the behavior towards women is accentuated. It's racially inspired, but there's another factor on there too.
Hey, there's
I'm just curious, I feel like I should know this, but when the religious community came to the camp, when was that? And was there
1835.
1835? And so was that a primarily white?
Yes.
Okay, and so what role did the influx of white religious people have in what's happened to your ancestor?
So, and so when you think of the religious community, and think of religion in the United States, when you look at some of the former slave-holding states, their religion was based in that white men were dominant and people of color were to be subjugated. And so with that, if you have people coming on vacation, and they used to come and stay in tents, when Margaret bought her house, one of the first houses in the area, and where she is on 4th Central, hopefully you'll all come this afternoon, she actually has a view of the lagoon, not the lagoon, the inner harbor there. She actually has a view of that. So to understand, you have a woman in an obviously middle-class home running a business, a successful business. You have these people coming from areas where if they had been home, this woman would have been in a laundry, but she would be,
But they don't want to
she'd
see
be
her.
working for free as an enslaved person. So coming on vacation and seeing this woman, completely independent woman running a business, there is going to be triggers. And regardless of what you know, how good you think you are, if part of your religion is that the people of color are to be subservient to you, the last thing you want to see when you go on vacation, when you're in a tent, is this black woman running her own independent
So this is
business.
a really important part of the story to me, to our greater understanding, to the rewriting of the way this story gets told.
Yeah, and it hasn't been that long. You know, for
No.
example, you consider Highland Beach in Oak Bluffs, which is right behind where our market is. All right, that was a black neighborhood, and they were all encouraged to leave. One of those people is Dorothy West, by the way. Wrote for the Vineyard Gazette.
And I'd just comment, you know, you have a view of Oak Bluffs Harbor from 14th
Right,
century.
right.
Now, in the 19th century, it wasn't nearly so scenic,
Right.
and it didn't smell nearly
Yeah,
so good.
yeah.
Yeah, that was the
Because-
bathroom.
Because at that time, it was Lake Anthony, and it
Yeah.
wasn't yet connected to the ocean.
okay.
Yeah.
A quick thought that I wanted to toss into this mix. Andrew, you mentioned that the two constables who are named were also involved in campground affairs.
Yes.
Also, in terms of the response that the Rocker family had to these men, is it possible that this is very personal and that the constables were serving the town laws and the Commonwealth laws, but could this have, this is purely speculation, some personal origin that they, in their roles as campground administrators, did not want their developing community to have working class, because doing laundry is very much historically a working class occupation. Is there the possibility that, given these names keep coming up, is there something more to this that we don't yet have documentation to make a connection?
I think it's unlikely. You know, it was, you people are black, you know, wherever you're from. You know, it's like now, you know, I castigate people. They say, you know, well, African Americans. I'm like, you know, well, time out. I was born in 1958, so it wasn't until 1965, the year before I graduated high school, that I became an American because I had the right to vote. You know, and it's from the Voting Rights Act, you know, 1965. You know, and then the African thing, well, you know, I haven't been African. You know, if I was African, I'd still be black. Okay, you know, not what's happened over the years. You know, so the expression African American, you know, how do you say an African American slave? Does that just give that slave a promotion? Does that make it a little bit more okay, a little bit more acceptable, you know, than it would be otherwise? So, you know, these social constructs, we're going to have to start taking a good look at. You know, I say, you know, I have a nice Irish name like Finley. You know, I do. And he was. And I've seen pictures of, you know, several of my progeny or, you know, my ancestors, and, you know, they don't look a lot like me.
In terms of the timeline of the campground, I would say, based on what I've seen, in 1883, the policy and practice at that time was still more one of segregation, and it only subsequently, not that long subsequently, but by the 1890s, let's say, was transitioning to one of outright exclusion of people of color. But certainly the Camp Meeting Association presumably was in a position to prevent this from happening and didn't do so.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you all so much for sharing the story. Really appreciate the details and the thoughts here. I'm just kind of thinking about what Patricia had mentioned, and kind of following up, the instances that happened when the family was looking to go back to Chappaquiddick and there was an altercation. Is there any potential link between the men that were involved in that altercation and the men that were involved in Oak Bluffs at the time? Like, I imagine that, I'm just thinking of like, that could have been maybe a spark.
Right, because they didn't, the woman bested them out after that confrontation. Maybe, I think probably what ended up happening, and I think why it came out of the blue that November when they came with the arrest warrant, like it completely, nobody knew it was coming, nobody had any idea. So I think it was a case of they knew they could not themselves, remove these women. I also think they targeted Eunice because you cut the head of the snake off and or target the strongest. I think she would coalesce the group and probably was a strong voice for their family. So their intent was to remove her. But there's always been the thought in my mind that that they decided to target her, and there were people that involved in that first confrontation or sort of ginned up the rest of the group to make sure that they go to take these women, because when they went with several people, and I think it was a case of, but then they didn't win the day there and had to come back with a second group of reinforcements. So I think that there was might have been some personal grievances because in past with Eunice,
Thank you.
I was curious about the references to Chappaquiddick. What was the role of Chappaquiddick in the lives?
You mean the Chappaquiddick, the land, or the Chappaquiddick people, tribe, or?
The whole thing.
So we're
distinguished. I don't know enough to.
We are Chappaquiddick. We're Chappaquiddick members. At that point, there was not a thriving government, and just so. Right now, the way the system is set up, Mashpee and Aquinnah are federally recognized tribe. The tribal government systems that are used today are based upon plains model, where you have large groups of people roaming and following the buffalo. With the Wampanoag and Eastern Woodland people, we lived in small clans and bands. The mothers, the matriarchs were chosen for those families, and then we would have powwows, a gathering. Situate used to be where the Wampanoag used to go to gather together, and decisions would be made cooperatively. So there would be one standing person. And when you talk about, King Philip and all of these different individuals of the great Wampanoag chief, we chose our chiefs or our leaders based upon their area of speciality. So if we were going to go and do a whale hunt, there used to be a large whale hunt that would happen out in the Bay Colony of Massachusetts, because they said that you used to be able to look out and all you would see is the backs of whales. So what would end up happening is we would pick a chief that would lead the hunt for the whale. So that would be probably the best guy to go out, stick an older person in the boat. They will help us decide who the older whales are, and that's who we would target. If we decided that we wanted to go deer hunting as a group of one people, because what we would do is we would herd the deer into a certain area and then go in, and whoever could either spear quickly and stay away from the deer getting you, or shoot the bow. So the concept of tribal leadership is very different from what you understand tribal leadership to be. There were leaders, and I would say that Eunice was probably the leader of her people and her group. We were more in clans and bands. So there was no formal government. What you see, some of the government now, you see a lot of pictures of the Mashpee and not picking on them, Mashpee and Quinny, you see them a lot with a headdress of the plains headdresses back in that period of time. And a lot of those individuals were also of European descent. So you will see certain names on certain tribes and you will automatically know that they are of European descent. And they have the privilege of keeping their land, whereas opposed to if you're looking at other groups of people like the Deep Bottom, like the Chappaquiddick, like the Herring Pond, and some of the other tribes where they were purely indigenous or had mixed with African, are being treated very differently. So it was easier for some tribes to keep their land because they had married into European families and had the privilege of going to have this type of government and those types of things. And not all of us had that privilege. And that fed into us losing some of our land and being treated differently as you see today. Because this probably is not the only occurrence, and there's probably a lot of stuff out there that we don't know about, but they made these women's lives very, very difficult. And with us here on Chappaquiddick, most of the males were whalers, so the women were on the island surviving by themselves, and what they were doing is fighting against white male aggression, and that's, there's no other word for it. You see women that are put in these situations where just, all they're trying to do is survive. They bought their home, they've got their own business, they're taking care of their families, and saying someone's a pauper and out of the blue and even the doctor couldn't go when he went to court, justify what these were, because when they looked at the document from 2006, the person that was writing that, I don't remember the gentleman's name, writing that document, he had said the cost of that would be a woman lying in from a pregnancy which would have to have continual care. So my question becomes is, who was this doctor? And that's more research that we need to do. And what did he have to do with Cottage City and Edgartown and all of those that played into that he was willing to plagiarize, not plagiarize, what's the word, when you go to court and lie? Perjure himself to say that these debts were owed. So, that's...
So Eunice would have had an identification with Chappaquiddick.
Yeah, we are Chappaquiddick, yeah.
The tribe and the island or the...
Yeah. In Chappaquiddick, the Chappaquiddick people, our sub camp was on Chappaquiddick, but we came out to probably the Tisbury area. Aquina was the largest, Deep Bottom, and who's the other, Margaret? Christiantown. Yeah. So we were spread out. We shared resources, but we would winter here where we weren't facing directly into the storms. Chappaquiddick was summer, cooling breezes and
If I could just go back to one of Nora's earlier questions about how, maybe your first question about how new information changes the way that we look at the story. I mean, I've heard several new things just in the course of this discussion that have informed my understanding of the story.
Louder.
I say, in going back to Nora's first question about how new information changes how we see the story, I've heard several items of information just in the course of the conversation this morning that have informed my understanding to some extent of some of this research. One of them being the matriarchal nature of the Wampanoag society. One thing I found in looking at our old lease records, particularly for this rediscovered community on our western fringe, but the same applies also to the neighborhood of the northern part of Central Avenue, is that the leaseholders were predominantly women to a much greater extent than what you found elsewhere in the campground, and that might have something to do with it.
Right.
Another thing I'm seeing that it hadn't registered with me, but this, forced removal, the order to effect the forced removal is dated January of 1883. The article that describes it is February of 1883. So evidently these people, the family was a year-round resident in a community which is still to then as now largely seasonal. And that might have given offense to the town or to the neighbors or to the communities that here was a family of color established itself year-round amongst white neighbors who were only seasonal.
Going back to the reference to the doctor, I actually read some of that doctor's journal, and he was part of there was a ruling system, it seems to me, a coercive system. The doctor would be part of that. I found a reference to a Native American woman in Christiantown called Hannah Nevers, and I actually went out of my way afterwards to track what happened to Hannah. The doctor noted in his record, the same doctor, that he had delivered the baby, and the baby seemed to be white. And she says, this was his exact phrase, she says, the father is the Irishman. That was the reference. That doesn't sound like a doctor's reference, it sounds more like part of a coercive system. I looked up Hannah Nevers, and she was married to that Irishman in the Catholic Church in Vineyard Haven, and they had several other children. But seeing that reference makes you realize what the doctor's role was in enforcing this system. They were keeping very close eyes on what happened to Native people. There's a very interesting report to the Massachusetts Commission for Indian Affairs. It's at the Widener Library in Harvard, and it's available online. And it talks about Chappaquiddick specifically, talks about the poverty and how they die. And one sentence that sticks in my mind, it said, the fatality or mortality rate is very excessive, but this often happens when barbarous people encounter civilization.
Civilization. Our germs, for example.
That gives you a concept of what this coercion was about.
I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Okay, this has been great. Thank you so much. I have two questions. One, where is Eunice Roberts' grave? Where's the stone?
It's in the Oak West Cemetery across the street from the town library.
Okay.
It's in there, and it's probably like 2 blocks on the right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And my second question is, what happened to the ownership of Margaret Prince Matthews' house after this whole incident?
Is the Wilson family? Well,
Just me. Another Margaret Bachman. She's buried on the other side. Walk in to the left on the cemetery.
It's with the Wilson family now, and that's one of the things that we've all agreed with. I'm calling them the Wilson sisters. There's 3 of them. We're going to research what happened because there was a transfer to 3. It went from Margaret Prince Matthews to another Margaret to Margaret's grandmother, Margaret Wilson. Was it Wilson or no?
Oh my gosh, it had to be.
Yeah. So we're gonna research that because as we've been walking through this journey, it started with Elaine, became conversation with Andrew, and then became conversations with Skip. Since that conversation I had with Elaine back 2 weeks before Christmas, I was like,
Yes.
Before the holiday season starts, I just need to talk to you about Eunice Rocker, and then we can talk about it afterwards. And then we started talking to the Wilson family.
We spoke on Mother's Day.
Yeah, Mother's Day. So we've been moving this train very, very quickly because the Chappaquiddick are here for this week, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to move forward with some of the dedications and ceremonies, and just make sure this happened well. You know, predominantly our tribe was on the island, and members of the other clan also.
And just another small note about how interesting the timing is on our end. My sisters and I only took ownership of the house a year and a half ago, and I'll put it this way: the family members that owned it prior to us, they would have not been interested. So we're just really grateful that the timing happened when it did, so that way, we could put the plaque on the house and let everybody know the story that's not sitting in this room. So the timing is wild.
Frankly, a few years ago, I'm not sure how interested the Camp Meeting Association. just saying,
The house will be dedicated as a site on the African American Heritage Trail at 1 o'clock today. If you can get there, 14 Central Avenue in Oak Bluffs, and Eunice Rocker's story will be told to the community and to anybody who's walking by. That plaque is beautiful. It's very, very detailed. It tells the story. This is all Patricia's work. It's beautifully done. And UPS lost it. I know.
There was panic on Wednesday, but
There was
it
a
showed up.
There was a total panic. And then I looked, UPS, you can't talk to UPS. You have to talk to
You just track down a driver.
various robotic systems that don't work, so it was quite frustrating. And then I thought, well, they sent me a link. I looked at the history, and it said it arrived in Chelmsford, Mass, on the 13th, and it never left. Because, you know, it arrived, departed, no departing. So we called UPS. Well, it took about 5 hours to get a human being. And then the human being, I have to say, wasn't very concerned about that. And he said, oh, file a claim. And I thought, oh, this is the week that here I must tell Patricia this situation has happened. It had never happened in 20 years of putting plaques up. It had never happened. The next day, we get a link from UPS. Oh, it's in Vineyard Haven. It'll be
I put it in the hands of our ancestors.
It just knocked a few years off Patricia's life, but it's there.
Well, thank you all to our panelists, especially those